In this section of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about how we measure economic development. What we mean by economic development is the extent or level of material well-being for members of a society or country, the command over goods and services that they have. So we mean things like how much food they have available to consume, the amount of healthcare they can afford, the types of transport they have available. So economic development is about the amount of goods and services that a society or country has available. And so a measure of economic development has to be something that tells us about the amount of goods and services that are available. A problem, though, is that it would be quite cumbersome to try and compare the quantity of goods and services in a society or country, for example, across time. On this slide I've got an example where I say, suppose there was an economy that produced just chairs and motor cars. And suppose in the first year they produced 10 of each, in the second year they produced 20 chairs and 5 motor cars. If we were comparing the quantities directly, then it's quite difficult to know whether we'd say that the society was better off in year 1 or year 2. So instead, what we do is we create a measure of the value of the aggregate output of goods and services in a country or society. And that's a measure that we can use more easily, for example, to compare material well-being across time. The way we do that is we attribute a value to each of the goods or services that are produced. So, for example, if we think of a chair having a price of $10, a motor car having a price of $20,000, then in year 1 we could work out that the value of economic output in this country is $200,100. And by applying the same prices, we can work out that the value of economic output in year 2 is only $100,200. So by converting the amount of output that society produces into this value measure, we can more easily work out whether output, the value of economic output, has increased across time, what's happened to the level of economic development. One particular value measure, the value measure that's most commonly used by economists, is gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is a measure of the market value of final goods and services produced within a country in a given time period, excluding net income from abroad. A couple of important points about this measure. I've highlighted the word final. Final goods and services are goods and services that are ultimately consumed by households in a society, or in capital goods that are going to contribute to production process for firms. So, for example, apples that you might buy to eat, that would be an example of a final good, but the steel that a car manufacturer bought to produce cars wouldn't be included in GDP. That's because the value of the steel is going to be included in the value of the car, which is ultimately included in GDP as a final good. And so to include it earlier on would mean that we were double counting. The other word that I've highlighted there is market. Market means that we're valuing the goods and services that are produced in the country or society by the price at which they trade in markets. Now, one thing you'll notice about this GDP measure is that it's a measure of output. When we talked about economic development right at the start, I said that economic development is about the resources that the society has available to consume. So in using GDP as a measure of economic development, we're making an assumption that the amount of output a society or country produces is a good proxy for the amount of consumption that it's able to do. If we're interested in comparing GDP across time for a particular country, you'll often see the measure that's used, a measure that's called real GDP. Real GDP is an adjusted measure of GDP that controls for price changes across time. So ultimately, remember, what we really care about is the amount of goods and services that a society has available to consume. And we're converting that into a value measure because it's easier to deal with. One problem that brings is that there are two reasons why GDP could change across time. One reason is the volume of goods and services a country produces could change, or the price could change. So, for example, we might have a country which produces 10 chairs in 1 year and 10 chairs in the next year, but the price of a chair might increase from $10 to $20. That would mean that our GDP measure would increase from $100 to $200. But really, the country or society producing the chairs isn't any better off because it's producing the same number of chairs. So what we need to do is adjust our measure of GDP for price changes so that we can think that the measure of GDP is appropriately tracking changes in the volume of goods and services that are being produced. So real GDP is a way of trying to get a measure of GDP, a measure of the output of goods and services that's comparable across time. When we think about economic development, living standards, usually we're thinking in terms of the amount of resources available to each member of the population in a country. And so when we talk about living standards, usually we talk about a measure that's called real GDP per capita. It's equal to real GDP divided by population. And it's recognising that changes in GDP could occur because, for example, the size of the population increases. And that wouldn't necessarily be something that we wanted to think of as making the whole of the society better off. So we need to adjust our GDP measure for changes in the population size to give us a measure that tells us the living standards of each member in the population. So real GDP divided by population, we can think of that as a measure of the resources available to each member of society if resources were distributed equally across the society. GDP is, and in particular real GDP per capita, is the measure that we'll usually be dealing with to describe economic development in this course. Now nowadays there are many national statistical agencies that calculate GDP figures for their country and also sometimes for regions within the country. But because we're interested in the history of economic development, we're talking about time periods when national statistical agencies weren't collecting those data. And so economic historians have had to try to put together those data themselves. The most famous data series on GDP has been constructed by Angus Maddison. Angus Maddison called himself a chiffrophile, a lover of figures. Maddison believed in the value of quantification and the historical roots of economic development. And so he spent a large part of his career putting together data on GDP, per capita, GDP, population for all different regions around the world. Here I've shown data from Maddison's data from the year 1 through to 2008, which we've also looked at in the first part of this lecture. One point to make is that as we go further back in history, and in particular sort of before about 1820, the sources we have to construct GDP are imperfect. And so we have to think of there being some margin of error around the GDP numbers that we're using and that have been created by economic historians. As I've mentioned, in the course, we're going to be using GDP measures a lot as a measure of economic development. And there's good reasons for doing that. It's the measure that's historically available. It's a measure which gives us a good aggregate sense of the output that a country is producing, and we think that that's likely to be related to the amount that members of the society or country can consume, to a whole range of sort of well-being indicators such as life expectancy, literacy and health outcomes. But at the same time, it's good to understand that there are some limits to the GDP measure, and I'll just mention a couple of them briefly. One is GDP only includes output traded in markets. So for example, it excludes household production. This can be an issue if you're looking at an economy where over time the amount of household production has changed, or if you're comparing between different economies that have different amounts of household production. A second limit is that GDP doesn't take account of some of the costs of economic activity. For example, if economic activity is causing environmental degradation, that won't be taken into account in the measure of GDP, at least the standard measure. Third point is that GDP doesn't incorporate effects of quality improvements in products or the introduction of new products. So we know, for example, that a PC that cost $1,000 in the 1990s would be very different in quality to a PC that cost $1,000 today. But without adjustment, those two items would have exactly the same impact in GDP. They'd be counted the same way. The Berkeley economist Brad DeLong captured this idea really nicely, I think, in the following quote, when he said that when we hear that average GDP per worker in 1890 was equal to $13,700 at 2000 prices, that is, we're converting GDP from 1890 to express it in the same terms as 2000 prices. When we hear that average GDP per worker in 1890 was equal to $13,700 at 2000 prices, we think that the material standard of living then was roughly what we could obtain now if we had $13,700 to spend to support us for a year today. But that's not the case. The material standard of living then was roughly what we could obtain now if we had $13,700 to spend, but if we were required to spend it all or just on commodities that were around at that time, commodities which have been available now for more than a century. But as DeLong points out, about 45% of the value of what middle-class consumers in countries like the United States, industrial countries, use at present weren't invented or weren't in widespread use in the last years of the 20th century. So it's important to keep in mind that when we compare GDP across time, we're not incorporating this effect of improvements in the range of products we have available or the quality of products. Final issue about GDP is GDP really telling us about well-being? In the last couple of decades, economists have become increasingly interested in the question of whether GDP is about happiness or life satisfaction. This was a research area that was really commenced by Richard Easterlin, who pointed to something that's become known as the Easterlin paradox. Here I've taken some data on GDP per capita and also data on happiness from Richard Easterlin's original article that he wrote in the 1970s. And the Easterlin paradox, which you can see in this chart, is basically the idea that while GDP in, for example, the United States has increased in the post-World War II period, for example, by about 60% from World War II through to 1970, during that time, ratings of happiness or life satisfaction by people in the United States didn't change at all. And so Easterlin questioned whether life satisfaction was really driven by changes in the amount of goods and services we have available to consume. Now, in recent years, there's been quite a bit of debate about this Easterlin paradox and arguments back and forth about whether material well-being really is related to happiness. But I think it's important to raise the point that GDP is about the amount of goods and services we have available to consume, and we need to think about whether that's related to fundamentally to life satisfaction. Given that there are some issues with GDP, it's worth mentioning that there are other measures that economic historians and economists have used to try to measure well-being or economic development. Economic historians have, when GDP data hasn't been available or as alternatives to GDP data, have used two main types of measures. First of all, they've used biological measures such as life expectancy and stature as indicators of health and well-being in previous times. Another indicator is urbanisation. Here the idea is that societies that have industrialised more are going to be societies that are more urbanised, and so that we can think of urbanisation as a proxy for the amount of industrialisation, the extent to which an economy is advanced. On this next slide, I've tried to give you a feel for why urbanisation might be a reasonable measure of economic development. I've taken some data from 2005 from the World Bank data bank on the urbanisation rate and GDP per capita for about 200 countries. And you can see that there's in general, a positive relationship between GDP per capita and urbanisation. So urbanisation, at least today, is a reasonable predictor of the extent of industrialisation and hence GDP per capita or economic development. There have been other approaches as well. One approach has been to say, well, look, if there are problems with GDP, maybe we should correct the measure of GDP for those problems. So, for example, you could have an index of sustainable economic welfare, which corrects the GDP measure for environmental effects of economic development. Or the UN Human Development Index, which integrates GDP per capita with measures of life expectancy and literacy to try and create a broader measure of well-being. A particularly innovative recent approach from Vernon Henderson, an economist at Brown University, and several colleagues has been to use data on night lights as a potential measure of economic development. So Henderson and his colleagues used data from the US Air Force Defence Meteorological Satellite program to map out the pattern of night lights across the world. And you can see here why sort of night lights might be a measure that you could use to tell you about economic development. You can see that the areas where there's lots of lights are the areas of North America, Western Europe, Japan, and you can see regions along the coast of China, for example, as well. What Henderson and his colleagues did was to create an adjusted measure of GDP, which used the GDP from countries' national accounts with an indicator of economic development based on these night lights data. And their idea was that because the night light data provides an independent measure of industrialisation or economic development, by integrating that with the statistical agency's data, you would end up with a better measure of GDP. And so here what I've done is I have a graph where on the horizontal axis I've got the statistical agency's measure of economic growth from 1992-3 to 2002-3, and on the vertical axis I've got the adjusted or optimal measure that Henderson and his colleagues calculated. So if an observation is sort of close to this 45-degree line, then that means that the two measures are pretty similar. And you see for lots of the countries that the statistical agency measure is not too far away from the adjusted measure that includes the lights data. But there are some countries for which there's quite a bit of difference. So for example, if you look at Papua New Guinea, its statistical agency said that it only had 1% average growth over this period, whereas the adjusted measure says 2.8%. And perhaps that's due to being difficult to collect data on GDP per capita in Papua New Guinea. Another example would be Myanmar, where the statistical agency said that the rate of economic growth was 8.5%, but the adjusted measure said only 5.8%. So that's been a bit of a perspective on GDP per capita, the measure that we're going to use for economic development throughout the course. In the rest of this lecture, I'm going to move on to talk about possible reasons for differences in economic development between countries around the world.